This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 290th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. Spring is always one of the most difficult times of the year to be disciplined as a writer. The outdoors is abloom with fresh smells and green buds everywhere, and warm sunshine. It's beckoning outside my window right now. I do make time to be outside, go hiking, sometimes just lie on the grass and appreciate the sun. But most of the time I have to settle for opening my window and staying at my desk. One thing I did do this year is buy a rolling laptop tray, which essentially gives me a desk anywhere in the house. So I can take my editing right over to that open window and still keep my comfy desk chair. The latest post in the video series on my blog is Afraid Your Book is Boring? Your character may not be doing this one important thing. It shows one of the top reasons it's possible your book is boring your readers and offers the easy and fun solution. To find the post, visit my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast entitled My Writing Process, Part 1 of 2, How I Use Scrivener to Outline My Novels. My writing process is a continually evolving thing. Not only does every new story require a slightly different approach, and not only am I constantly learning and refining, but sometimes a new tool comes along and completely revolutionizes the whole system. That's what the writing software Scrivener has done for my writing process this past year. For years, I've been extremely happy with the free organization program YWriter. One of my mottos has always been, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Besides, I kept hearing about Scrivener's steep learning curve. As much as I love new techie stuff, I kept thinking, I don't have time for that. But so many of you word players kept asking me about it that I finally broke down and bought it. 3 words. Blew my mind. Seriously, it was as if the designers looked into my brain and took notes while I was outlining my novels, and then designed my dream word processor, kind of like Extreme Home Makeover, but for writers. However, it is true that there's a bit of a learning curve. The program is tremendously detailed and thorough. It offers you just about any organizational tool your little heart could imagine. And if you're like me and Han, you can imagine quite a bit. So, in the interest of helping you take full advantage of this tremendous resource, today and next week, I'd like to offer a sneak peek under the hood of how my writing process works when using Scrivener. Even better, this is all a warm-up to the free webinar Learn Scrivener Fast with Joseph Michael, which I'll be hosting in a couple weeks. I hosted Joseph last summer, and you guys turned out in such numbers that your enthusiasm blew both Joseph's and my minds again. I used Joseph's awesome Learn Scrivener Fast course, so I highly recommend you join us for the webinar on April 23rd. More info on that next week. For today, here's how I use Scrivener to outline my novels using the approach I talk about in my book, Outlining Your Novel, Map Your Way to Success. This podcast isn't going to teach you how to use Scrivener. I'll leave that to Joe. So it does presuppose you have some understanding of how the basic features work. For example, the binder and inspector. My goal here is to show you how I actually use the features when outlining. To get the most out of this information, I suggest you hop over to my site and look at the accompanying post because it features screenshots of every single step, which will help give you a visual aid in figuring all of this out. My writing process, step 1, general sketches. My first step in outlining is to simply get my ideas for the plot and the character arcs onto paper and start working my way through the plot holes and questions until I have a viable story. This is where I will start figuring out all the major plot points in my story structure. I like to do all my brainstorming longhand in a notebook, and I use a color-coded highlighting system to help me know what I want to transcribe into Scrivener and what folder to put it in. I start with a summary of the story. Usually this is something I wrote long ago when the story idea first solidified for me. I stick this in a document at the top of the binder in Scrivener so I can refer to it to keep me on track throughout the outlining process. Plus, it's just fun to get some words in the file right from the start. And then it's time to start figuring out the story in earnest. Once I've worked out the basic shape of the plot, I can start figuring out how to fit in the 3-act structure, which of course I talk about in my other book, Structuring Your Novel. In Scrivener, I create a folder called Structure and subfolders for each of the primary structural turning points. This isn't my actual outline per se, as much as it is just rough notes to guide me when I start fleshing out the outline in detail. I keep this file and all outline-specific files in the research folder. I use the short summaries of each section so I can view them at a glance in the corkboard section. Theme is also something I start working out early in the process since it's so inherently linked to the character arcs. I create a separate file for that as well so I can have easy access to any pertinent thematic notes that don't fit elsewhere. When you're using the corkboard, I suggest using the corkboard settings in the bottom right corner to adjust the size, ratio, and lots more of your note cards. Orange notes are how I refer to any pertinent information that doesn't have an obvious home somewhere else in my outline notes. I call them this because they are highlighted in orange in my notebook. They get their own folder in the research section as well. My writing process step 2, character sketches. Once I have a basic sense of the entire plot, I move on to character sketches. This is where I will interview my characters using the list of 100 plus questions, which you can find in Outlining Your Novel or the Outlining Your Novel workbook. I create a folder for characters, then a sub-file for each major character. Scrivener offers the opportunity to include photos, so I always add the actor I've cast as the character. I also add a file indicating the major archetypes I want to include and which character fulfills which role. I like to keep my minor characters in a separate folder in order to streamline the appearance of the binder and keep my major characters easily accessible. I also include a folder for unused characters, whom I may have dreamed up early in the outline, but never found a home for in the actual story. Another thing I like to do is create keywords for each character and setting, and then later on add them to each scene in which they're present in order to help you keep track of their appearances. My writing process, step 3, settings and other considerations. I also create folders for settings, costumes, animals, and vehicles and weapons if appropriate. I collect images of each of these as needed while outlining so that I have a visual library to draw from when writing. In the inspector, you can select the photo option and then drag in your image. My writing process, step 4, extended outline. Finally, I'm ready to start my extended outline, the nitty-gritty of the outline itself. This is where I work out the story chapter by chapter, paying attention to the structure of each scene, goal, conflict, disaster, and sequel, reaction, dilemma, decision. Once I've completed the extended outline in my notebook, I'll transcribe the pertinent notes, which I highlight in blue, to Scrivener. I use Dragon Naturally Speaking for this step to save the wear on my wrists from all that typing. This is where I move up into the actual manuscript section of the binder and start creating the folders that become my chapters. I start by creating master folders for the major structural sections, then subfolders for each chapter, and files within those folders for each scene. I generally break the scenes into multiple files, one for the scene and one for the sequel. Another handy thing I like to do is customize my icons in the binder by right-clicking a file and choosing Change Icon. The synopsis section of the inspector is where I record the actual structure of the scene, as well as the date and time in which the scene is going to take place. Below that, in the general metadata section, I use the color-coded labels to indicate whether the file holds a scene, a sequel, or both. This particular book that I'm working on right now only has a single POV. If I had multiple POVs, I'd also probably use these labels in the general metadata section to indicate whose POV the scene is supposed to take place in. Finally, the document notes section at the bottom of the inspector is where I type in the entirety of my outline notes for each scene. My writing process, step 5, research. While not actually a part of what I consider the outlining phase, I'll also mention research in this episode since it has to take place before the first draft begins. I create a master folder for my research, then subfolders for each category to allow for easy reference. I also add a master file at the top that records my bibliography. One handy thing to keep in mind when you're pasting in research notes is to right-click and choose Paste and Match Style to maintain the same formatting throughout your Scrivener document. My writing process, step 6, read this document. Finally, I add a read this document at the very top of my manuscript, titled all in caps. This will contain any pertinent notes I want to make sure I'm keeping in mind as I write. You can also use the arrows in the top right corner of the notes section in the inspector to toggle between specific document notes and universal project notes. Once I've completed all that, I'm locked and loaded and ready to start writing. Next week I'll be sharing with you how I then use Scrivener when I'm actually writing my first draft. I hope this will benefit you in finding the right process to organize your own outline notes in Scrivener and to use this powerful program to up your writing game. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.